Settle in, and let us travel back to a time when a tiny, slimy creature could bring the most powerful postal system in Europe to its knees. Our story begins not with kings or battles, but with something far more mundane, the intricate, often frustrating world of mail delivery in 18th century France. Picture the French postal system, the post-au letters. In the year 1780, it was a marvel of its time, a finely tuned network of riders, coaches, and post houses connecting Paris to the farthest corners of the kingdom. Each letter, each package, was a small, vital thread in the sprawling tapestry of French commerce, politics, and social life. But this system, like any complex machine, had its quiet, unassuming weak points. One of the most critical and least glamorous was the paper used for official correspondence, and more importantly, the glue that sealed the envelopes. The glue wasn't some manufactured chemical paste from a modern factory. Instead, it was a simple, organic concoction, often made from animal hides, bones, or a starch-based mixture. It was effective enough, but it had a significant flaw. It was a delicious source of protein and carbohydrates for an unwelcome guest. This is where our main character, the humble snail, enters the stage. In the gardens of Paris and the lush green countryside, snails were a ubiquitous part of the landscape. The pettigrease, or garden snail, a species common across Europe, was generally seen as a minor pest, a nuisance to gardeners, but nothing more. No one, not a single minister or bureaucrat, ever imagined that this slow-moving mollusk could pose a threat to the efficiency of the French state. The post houses, the hubs of the postal network, were often rustic buildings with dirt floors and damp stone walls. They were not sterile, climate-controlled environments. Mail sacks, bulging with letters, were often stored in these cool, humid conditions. This created a perfect storm. The organic glues used to seal the letters, particularly those with a slightly sweet, starch-based formula, proved to be an irresistible delicacy for any snails that happened to wander inside. It started small, a few scattered complaints. A merchant in Lyon would receive a letter from Paris with a suspicious half-a-ton flap. A bureaucrat in Bordeaux would open a package to find the seals broken, the contents slightly damp with a trail of slime. At first, these were dismissed as simple accidents, the result of careless handling or the unpredictable nature of long-distance transport. But as the complaints began to pile up, a pattern started to emerge. The problem wasn't limited to a single route or post house. It was happening everywhere. From the Mediterranean coast to the northern border, letters were arriving with their envelopes compromised. The clerks and postmasters, initially bewildered, began to investigate. They found the telltale signs, tiny, jagged holes along the edges of the seals, faint trails of dried mucus, and, in some particularly egregious cases, the remains of the very culprits themselves. The realization was slow to dawn, but it was undeniable. Snails were eating the mail. You might be thinking, how significant could this really be? But consider the volume. In the late 18th century, the post-au letters was handling hundreds of thousands of letters a year. A single compromised letter could mean a delayed business deal, a missed payment, or a garbled political directive. Multiply that by thousands of incidents, and the system began to seize up. It was a silent, creeping crisis, one that didn't involve grand armies or dramatic political conspiracies, but rather the slow, methodical chewing of a tiny gastropod. The French government, ever so concerned with order and control, was completely at a loss. Their traditional methods of problem-solving, sending a gendarme or drafting a new decree, were useless against a biological enemy. How do you issue an edict against a snail? The very idea was absurd. Yet the problem was real. Mail was being delayed. Seals were being broken. Confidential information was potentially being exposed, all because of a pest that couldn't be reasoned with or intimidated. The postal minister at the time, a man named Jean-Baptiste de Neuilly, was a meticulous and high-strung individual. He saw the postal system as a reflection of the state's strength and efficiency. The idea that his well-oiled machine was being gummed up by snails was a source of immense personal and professional humiliation. He organized a series of increasingly desperate measures. They tried adding a bitter herb to the glue, hoping to deter the snails. The snails, it seemed, didn't mind a little flavor. They tried storing the mail in elevated cages, but some post houses were too small, and the problem persisted on the road, where the mail sacks rested in damp carriage holds. The situation was spiraling into a low-grade logistical crisis. The mail was a lifeblood of the French economy, and its reliability was paramount. Merchants, bankers, and even members of the aristocracy were growing restless. The king's court was receiving a stream of complaints about delayed correspondence. The snail, it seemed, had a reach far beyond the damp cellars of the French post offices. Its tiny, gnawing mouth was slowly, systematically unraveling a critical piece of the French state, and so the great snail famine of 1782 began not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet, insidious erosion of trust and efficiency, a crisis born from the simple fact that a snail's dinner preference could disrupt. The question became, how do you wage a war against an opponent that is slow, silent, and entirely unconcerned with the rules of human conflict? A question that would baffle the best minds of the French bureaucracy and lead to some truly bizarre and unexpected solutions. The crisis deepened, and the French bureaucracy, a machine built on logic and procedure, found itself in a frustrating deadlock. The snail, an enemy without a face or a flag, had exposed a fundamental vulnerability in the system. The complaints from merchants and officials escalated, and the postal minister, Jean-Baptiste Neuilly, was under immense pressure. He convened a special committee, a commission extraordinaire, to address the snail problem. It was a moment of profound administrative absurdity. The brightest minds of the French state were now tasked with solving a problem more suited for a gardener than a government minister. The initial proposals were a mixture of common sense and sheer desperation. One suggestion, seriously considered and even trialed, was to employ small, highly trained birds, specifically sparrows, to patrol the post houses, devouring any snails they found. The sparrows, it turned out, were far more interested in the grains stored in the stables than in the small, slimy creatures on the mail sacks. The program was an expensive failure, leaving only a new series of bureaucratic memos on the logistical challenges of managing a flock of government-sanctioned birds. Another proposal involved the use of salt. It was well known that salt dehydrated and killed snails. The plan was to create a thin, protective barrier of salt around all mail sacks and storage areas. This, however, created a new set of problems. Salt is corrosive, and a light dusting was not enough to deter the snails. A heavier application began to damage the paper and ink of the letters themselves, a problem arguably worse than the snails. Furthermore, the sheer volume of salt required was astronomical and prohibitively expensive. The French state was on the verge of creating a new, separate logistical crisis: a salt shortage. The most bizarre, and perhaps most emblematic, of the failed solutions was the Snail Eradication Decree of 1783. It was a formal government edict, drafted with all the solemnity of a law, that declared the snail a public enemy of the state. It mandated that all postmasters and postal workers were to actively hunt and destroy any snails found on postal property. The decree even went so far as to include a rudimentary drawing of a pedigree snail. The result was predictable. Postal workers, already overworked and underpaid, found the new duty ridiculous. They were mail carriers, not pest controllers. The decree was largely ignored, a testament to the fact that you cannot legislate away a biological problem. Amidst this flurry of ineffective and often absurd solutions, a young postal clerk named Etienne Dubois emerged with an idea. A quiet, unassuming man who spent his days meticulously sorting letters in a small, damp post office on the outskirts of Paris. Unlike the high-minded ministers in Versailles, he was intimately familiar with the day-to-day reality of the postal network. He had seen the snail problem firsthand and had spent countless hours observing the creatures. His insight was remarkably simple. The snails weren't just eating the glue. They were also attracted to the dampness of the storage areas. The glue was merely a convenient meal. The real problem was the environment. Etienne proposed a two-part solution that ignored the grand pronouncements of the Commission Extraordinaire and focused on practical, logistical details. First, he suggested a change in the glue itself. He experimented with different recipes, not to make the glue taste bad, but to make it less appealing. He found that a simple, plant-based resin mixed with a small amount of alum, a bitter and slightly acidic mineral, was unpalatable to the snails. The alum didn't harm the paper or the ink, but it made the glue taste terrible. The snails, after a tentative nibble, would simply move on. Second, he proposed a revolution in storage. Instead of storing mail sacks on the damp floors of the post houses, he suggested using simple wooden racks to elevate the sacks by at least a foot. He also advocated for improved ventilation in the storage rooms. The goal was to create a drier, less hospitable environment for the snails. Etienne reasoned that if the snails were not comfortable, they would not be there in the first place. His proposal was met with skepticism. The ministers in Paris thought it was too simple, too mundane. They wanted a grand, sweeping solution, a decree that would forever be known as the Denoli Edict. But with all other options exhausted, they reluctantly gave Etienne's plan a trial. Run in a few of the most heavily affected post houses, the results were immediate and dramatic. The number of compromised letters in the trial locations plummeted. The simple, unglamorous solution of changing the glue and elevating the mail sacks was working. It was not a grand victory, but a quiet, methodical one, a testament to the power of a keen eye for detail and a practical, hands-on approach. The crisis was not yet over. But for the first time in 2 years, the French state had a viable path forward. The snail, once an unstoppable force, was now a manageable nuisance. But the real challenge remained: how to implement such a small, boring change across a sprawling, inefficient bureaucracy that was resistant to anything other than a top-down mandate. Etienne Dubois's practical solution was a quiet success in the trial post offices, but it faced a far greater enemy than the snails themselves: bureaucracy. The Commission Extraordinaire, having spent months and vast sums of money on grandiose, failed schemes, was deeply reluctant to admit that a humble clerk's simple ideas were the answer. To accept his proposal was to acknowledge their own incompetence and the absurdity of their previous efforts. The ministers, clinging to their dignity, initially tried to take credit for the plan, rebranding it as the Strategic Elevation and Alum Protocol. But Etienne's name was already circulating among the postal workers who had seen his simple method work firsthand. The turning point came not from a top-down mandate, but from a bottom-up revolution. Frustrated by the delays and the constant complaints from the public, postal clerks across France began to informally adopt Etienne's methods. They started mixing alum into their gluza simple purchase from a local apothecary and used whatever they could find to elevate their mail sacks, be it old wooden crates, discarded barrels, or even piles of stones. This was a direct defiance of the established but ineffective protocols. It was a silent rebellion of efficiency, a testament to the fact that when faced with a common annoying problem, people will often find a simple solution, regardless of official orders. The results were undeniable. As the number of snail-damaged letters plummeted nationwide, the French state was forced to acknowledge the success. The Commission Extraordinaire was quietly disbanded, and Etienne Dubois was officially, if a bit grudgingly, lauded as a hero. His methods were formally adopted across the post-O letters. The new glue formula was standardized, and every post house was required to construct simple wooden racks for mail storage. The Great Snail Famine, a crisis born of a tiny was finally over. The story of the snail famine is a perfect microcosm of how history often works. It wasn't resolved by a grand decree or a brilliant military strategy. It was a problem solved by focusing on the mundane, on the overlooked details of daily life. It was a victory not for kings or generals, but for a thoughtful postal clerk who understood his own small world better than the ministers who governed it. This event, now a forgotten footnote in the annals of French history, had a profound and lasting impact. It subtly shifted the government's approach to logistical problems. The success of Etienne's method demonstrated the value of listening to those on the ground, the very people who experienced the issues firsthand. It was a quiet, bureaucratic lesson in humility and practicality. The incident also highlights the fragility of complex systems. The French postal service was a marvel of engineering and organization, but it was vulnerable to the simplest of threats: a slow, unassuming creature with a taste for starch. It is a reminder that the great moments of history are often influenced not just by the grand actions of powerful figures, but also by the small, almost boring details of life. It's the story of how an empire's communication network was brought to the brink by a snail, and saved not by a king, but by a clerk, with a keen eye for a more practical solution. The legacy of the Great Snail Famine isn't a famous battle or a grand monument. It's in the quiet, dusty corners of history books and the unwritten rules of bureaucratic efficiency. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most significant events are the ones that are the most mundane. It begs the question, how many other critical moments in history were shaped by equally small, unseen forces? Settle in and let's turn our attention from a tiny snail to a colossal feat of engineering, the Roman aqueducts. While we often marvel at their majestic arches stretching across the countryside, the true story of these vital lifelines lies not in their grand construction, but in the mundane, backbreaking, and surprisingly political work of their maintenance. This is the story of the curators, aquarum, the aqueduct, inspectors, and their world of concrete, bureaucratic filings, and the constant threat of a slow etter aquarum, or commissioner of water, a high-ranking official who oversaw the entire system. But below this grand title were the real workhorses, the inspectors and maintenance crews who spent their days in the subterranean gloom and scorching sun, ensuring Rome didn't run dry. Let's delve into the world of Sextus Julius Frontinus, a prominent curator, aquarum, in the late 1st century CE. His writings, particularly his treatise De Aqueductu, on the aqueducts of the city of Rome, are our primary source for this fascinating administrative and technical history. Frontinus was a meticulous man, and his record-keeping was a model of bureaucratic excellence. He didn't see his job as just managing a flow of water. He saw it as upholding the moral and physical health of Rome. For him, a well-maintained aqueduct was a symbol of Roman discipline and order. Frontinus's first challenge was not a technical one, but a bureaucratic one. Before he took office, the system was a tangled mess of private ownership, corruption, and sloppy record-keeping. Wealthy citizens would illegally tap into the main lines to divert water to their private villas and gardens, a practice known as puncta perforata, or pierced holes. The practice was so common that the pressure in the pipes dropped significantly, reducing the water supply to public fountains and baths. Frontinus's initial task was a massive audit. He sent his inspectors, the equerri, on foot along the entire length of the aqueducts, a journey of hundreds of miles, to meticulously document every single tap, every leak, and every unrecorded diversion. This was an exercise in pure, unglamorous drudgery. The inspectors, armed with lead tablets and styluses, would trace the main lines, noting every illegal pipe they found, and every unauthorized connection that fed a private villa. The work was dangerous and demanding. Inspectors had to navigate the dark, damp, and often claustrophobic tunnels of the subterranean sections of the aqueducts. The air was thick with humidity and the musty smell of ancient earth. They had to be part engineer, part detective, and part bureaucrat. A leak, for instance, wasn't just a technical problem. It was a paper trail problem. They had to trace its source, measure the amount of water being lost, and file a detailed report with the central office in Rome. This was done without the benefit of modern maps or GPS. They relied on their intimate knowledge of the landscape and the intricate network of channels and pipes. The materials they worked with were simple but effective. The channels, or spicus, were lined with a reddish-brown plaster known as opus signinum, a waterproof mixture of crushed tile and mortar. This was the first line of defense against leaks. The inspector's job was to constantly monitor the integrity of this lining. They would have to flag these imperfections for the maintenance crews, who would then patch them with new Opus C. The constant patching and repatching meant that the aqueduct channels, from a modern perspective, would have been a patchwork of different shades and textures, a visual record of centuries of continuous repair. The bureaucracy around this process was as complex as the physical infrastructure itself. Every repair, every inspection, and every report had to be carefully documented. Frontinus's office was a hub of administrative activity, with scribes painstakingly copying reports from the field onto scrolls. The cost of materials, the man-hours for labor, and the projected water loss from leaks were all meticulously calculated. The focus was on prevention and efficiency. An aqueduct that was not running at full capacity was considered a failure, both technically and fiscally. And so, the life of a Roman aqueduct inspector was one of quiet, methodical vigilance. They were the unsung heroes who ensured that the public fountains flowed, the public baths were warm, and the city's latrines flushed. Their lives were a testament to the fact that the glory of Rome was built not just on the triumphs of its legions or the eloquence of its senators, but on the relentless, boring, and essential work of those who maintained its most basic infrastructure. It was an endless battle against nature, decay, and human greed. But what would happen when this constant vigilance failed? When a leak, small at first, grew into a catastrophic breach, threatening the water supply of an entire district of Rome? And how did a single, determined inspector, armed with nothing but a stylus and a lead tablet, manage to track down the source of a leak that had baffled his predecessors for months? The mundane world of the Roman aqueduct inspector was fraught with small-scale disasters. One of the most insidious problems was the incrustatio, the mineral deposits that built up on the interior walls of the spicus over time. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic event like a breach, but a slow, gradual hardening of calcium and other minerals that effectively shrunk the channel, reducing water flow. The inspectors, armed with small hammers and chisels, would periodically have to chip away at this rock-hard coating, a tedious and physically demanding task that was absolutely critical for maintaining the system's capacity. Imagine the claustrophobic conditions, a dark tunnel, the echoing ring of a hammer on stone, and the constant, cold trickle of water. It was a job for the patient and the persistent. Beyond these regular maintenance issues, there was the ever-present threat of a major leak. The most frustrating of these weren't the obvious breaks, but the slow, persistent seepage that defied detection. For years, one particular aqueduct, the Aqua Claudia, had been plagued by a mysterious loss of water. The engineers in Rome couldn't figure it out. The flow rate was consistently lower than it should have been, yet no major leak was visible from the surface. The problem was a source of immense frustration for the curators aquarum and a minor scandal in Rome. Where was the water going? Enter Flavius, a junior inspector with a reputation for meticulousness. Unlike his more senior colleagues who would walk the entire length of the aqueduct looking for a breach, Flavius took a different approach. He reasoned that the leak was likely a small fissure, hidden in a subterranean section, or buried under the terrain. He decided to apply a simple but radical new method of detection. Instead of looking for the leak, he would listen for it. He constructed a rudimentary stethoscope-like device, a simple hollow reed with a wider opening, which he would press against the ground above the aqueduct's route. Walking the entire length of the Aqua Claudia, he would stop every few yards, kneel down, and listen. The process was painstakingly slow and attracted derision from his colleagues, who found his method utterly ridiculous. For weeks, he heard nothing but the faint gurgle of water moving through the pipes and the sounds of the Roman countryside. But then, in a quiet, forested section near the Alban Hills, he heard it, a faint but distinct hissing sound, like air escaping a lung. It was not the sound of flowing water, but of water under pressure, being forced through a tiny crack. He marked the spot and, to the great skepticism of his superiors, insisted on a small excavation. The digging crew, convinced they were on a fool's errand, began to work. After several feet of digging, they found it, a small, almost invisible fissure in the aqueduct's mortar lining. It was no wider than a man's thumb, but it was releasing a steady stream of water into the surrounding soil, where it was quickly absorbed, leaving no trace on the surface. It wasn't a geyser, it was a silent, slow hemorrhage that had been bleeding the aqueduct for years. The discovery was a minor sensation among the aqueduct engineers. Flavius's ingenious, low-tech solution had solved a problem that had baffled the best minds in Rome. The leak was repaired, and the Aqua Claudia's flow rate returned to normal. Flavius was praised, but the incident also highlighted the immense logistical and technical challenges of maintaining such a vast, sprawling system. It was a constant battle against the slow, creeping forces of nature and entropy. A system built on the bedrock of Roman engineering was still only as good as the men who walked its length, with their tools and their knowledge to ensure its survival. The question became, how did the Romans, with their limited technology, create a bureaucratic and technical system that could respond to these continuous challenges? And what lessons did their meticulous record-keeping hold for future generations of engineers and administrators? The methodical approach of the Roman aqueduct inspectors, exemplified by Flavius's low-tech ingenuity, was the backbone of a system that lasted for centuries. It was a testament to the power of a proactive rather than reactive maintenance culture. The curators aquarum understood that it was far more efficient to prevent a crisis than to manage one. Their legacy was not just the physical aqueducts themselves, but the meticulous administrative system they built to sustain them. Frontinus, in his treatise, emphasized the importance of record-keeping. He mandated that every section of every aqueduct be meticulously documented, from the size of the pipes to the flow rate and the date of the last inspection and repair. These records, kept on lead tablets and parchment scrolls, created a living history of the system. A future inspector, faced with a recurring leak, could look back at the historical data to identify a pattern or a chronic weak spot. Early form of predictive maintenance, a concept that seems modern but was a cornerstone of Roman engineering. The lessons learned from a small leak in the Aqua Claudia Raminero buildup in the Anno Novus weren't just for the engineers. They were for the Roman state itself. The aqueduct system, with its thousands of miles of channels and pipes, was a physical manifestation of Rome's power and its commitment to public welfare. The health of the system was directly linked to the health of the city. A well-maintained aqueduct meant a steady supply of clean water, which in turn meant better sanitation, public health, and a more stable populace. The aqueduct inspectors, in their boring and difficult work, were not just engineers. They were public health officials, ensuring the well-being of the city through their daily drudgery. The Roman approach to aqueduct management offers a fascinating parallel to our modern infrastructure. Today, we still face the same challenges: aging pipes, budget constraints for repairs, and the need for constant, unglamorous maintenance. The Roman solution: meticulous record-keeping, a focus on prevention, and a respect for the on-the-ground knowledge of those who do the work. The grandeur of the Roman Empire was built on more than just military might. It was built on the quiet, methodical work of people like Flavius, who understood that the true strength of a city lay not in its monuments, but in the unseen pipes that kept its lifeblood flowing. So, the next time you see a picture of a Roman aqueduct, try to look beyond the majestic arches. Picture the inspector, with his lead tablet and his hollow reed, listening to the ground, ensuring that the water, and with it the city, would endure for another day. It is a story of how boring, essential maintenance can be the most heroic act of all. Let us turn now to a story of profound but unglamorous power, not of a mighty emperor or a brilliant general, but of a quiet man whose authority lay not in a sword, but in a simple brush and an inkstone. We are in the sprawling, unified world of the Han Dynasty, 26 BCE to 220 CE to 220 CE, an empire of millions whose stability hinged on a single vital function: the efficient collection of taxes. In a time when the vast majority of the population was rural, subsisting on the land, the tax collector was the most direct and consequential link between the individual peasant and the emperor in his distant palace. Our story's central figure is a man named Guokai. He was not a minister in the imperial court or a scholar of great renown. He was a provincial tax collector stationed in a remote, dust-choked region known as Lianzhou, a place of harsh deserts and rugged mountains. His office was a small, unadorned room with a single window and a low table, upon which sat his tools: a pile of bamboo slips, a pot of ink, and a fine-tipped brush. His job was simple in its definition, yet immensely complex in its execution: to assess the agricultural output of the villages in his jurisdiction, and to ensure that the correct portion of grain, silk, and labor was sent to the imperial granaries. The Han tax system was a complex web of agricultural assessments and bureaucratic mandates. The primary tax was a percentage of the harvest, often around 1/30th of the crop. But it wasn't just about collecting grain. The peasants also owed a certain amount of corvée labor to the state for public works projects, such as building roads, canals, and, most famously, sections of the Great Wall. Additionally, there were taxes on certain goods, and, in some cases, a small head tax. For Guokai, this meant not only inspecting fields at harvest time, but also keeping meticulous records of every household, their family members, their land plots, and their annual output. This was the true nature of his power: the ledger. The bamboo slips he used for record-keeping were a tangible symbol of imperial authority. Each slip was a piece of the vast, intricate puzzle of the Han state. On these slips, Guokai would meticulously inscribe the name of each household, the size of their fields, and the amount of tax owed. This was an act of profound bureaucratic trust. The emperor, hundreds of miles away, had to trust that men like Guokai were being honest and accurate in their assessments. But this trust was a two-way street. The peasants had to trust that Guokai was fair, not demanding more than was due. And the local magistrate had to trust his figures were correct. Guokai, unlike many of his colleagues, was known for his diligence and, more importantly, his empathy. The life of a tax collector was often one of a conflicted moral standing. They were seen as the face of an often cruel and distant government. Many collectors, pressured to meet quotas, resorted to harsh and even violent methods, seizing property and grain to make up for shortfalls. Guokai, however, believed that the strength of the empire lay not in coercion, but in a stable, well-fed populace. He knew that a family that couldn't feed itself couldn't produce for the state. He spent his days not just in his office, but out in the fields, talking to the farmers, understanding the challenges they faced. He noted the erratic rainfall, the occasional pestilence, and the difficulties of tilling the hard, dry soil of Liangzhou. He began to include these details in his ledger notes, not just the raw data of how much grain was harvested, but the context. Behind the numbers, he would write small, descriptive notes. Harvest poor this year due to early frost. Or, family of Li Po suffered a sickness, reducing labor output. These notes, a small addition to the official ledger, were seen as an unusual and unnecessary indulgence by his superiors. They wanted numbers, not stories. Guo Kai's most radical act, however, was in his application of the tax law. He had some limited discretion. When a harvest was particularly bad, he would petition the central government for a reduction in the tax burden for his district, citing his detailed notes as evidence. This was a long, arduous process, involving multiple layers of bureaucracy. But Guo Kai persisted. He believed that this flexibility, this human touch, was what would prevent social unrest and rebellion. He was essentially performing a detailed socioeconomic survey of his region, all on his own initiative. He was a silent revolutionary. A man who saw his role not just as an agent of the state, but as a protector of his people. His notes, scrawled in the margins of the official record, were a plea for fairness, an argument for a more compassionate form of governance. But his radical approach was about to be put to the ultimate test. A major famine was approaching, a disaster that would threatened to collapse the fragile social order of the empire. The records he had so painstakingly kept would either save his people or be dismissed as a waste of time by a government that demanded its due, regardless of the cost. What would happen when a major famine struck Liangzhou? Would Guokai's humanistic approach be seen as an act of treason or an act of foresight? The famine that struck Liangzhou in the year 93 CE was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, creeping disaster. A long, unseasonably dry spring led to a poor planting season, and a searing summer withered the meager crops. As the autumn harvest approached, it became clear that the yields would be catastrophically low. The villages that Guokai oversaw were on the brink of starvation. This was the moment of truth for his humanistic approach to tax collection. The official imperial quota for his district remained fixed, based on the previous year's figures. The central government, insulated by distance and bureaucracy, expected its due. A lesser man, or a more pragmatic one, might have squeezed what little he could from the starving peasants, using force, if necessary, to meet his quota and save his own career. But Guokai had been preparing for this moment. His years of meticulous, detailed notes the small personal observations he had added to the official ledgers became his most powerful weapon. He drafted a formal petition to the emperor, a document that was a masterclass in bureaucratic finesse and moral persuasion. He did not simply plead for mercy. He presented a detailed, data-driven argument for a tax reduction. His petition was an unusual document for its time. It included not just a report on the current crop failure, but a series of historical data points from his ledgers. He showed that over the past 5 years, the average rainfall had been decreasing, and the harvest yields had been on a slow but steady decline. He correlated this with a documented rise in local unrest and banditry, arguing that the stability of the region was at risk. He pointed out the specific number of families who were without sufficient grain stores, and the projected number of deaths if the imperial tax was enforced. He also included something even more remarkable, a projection of future tax revenue. He argued that by granting a temporary tax relief, the government would ensure the survival of the farmers. A starving, dead farmer, he reasoned, pays no taxes. A surviving, indebted farmer, however, could be counted on to pay in the future. He was essentially arguing for a long-term investment in the well-being of the populace, an approach that was in stark contrast to the short-term, quota-driven thinking of his peers. His petition traveled the long, slow journey to the capital, city of Chang'an. It passed through the hands of provincial governors, imperial ministers, and finally, the Grand Secretariat. The scribes and officials who reviewed it were initially baffled by its content. They were used to seeing petitions filled with flowery language and desperate pleas, not with hard data and statistical analysis. But the sheer volume and detail of Guo Kai's notes were undeniable. He had documented not just a single crisis, but a slow-motion trend. He had the receipts, so to speak. The petition eventually reached the desk of a high-ranking official known as the Minister of Finance, who was known for his pragmatic and often ruthless approach to state finances. This minister was not swayed by empathy, but by logic. He saw the cold, hard numbers that Guo Kai had compiled and understood the tax collector's argument. The cost of a full-scale famine, the need for emergency grain shipments, the expense of military intervention to quell riots, and the long-term loss of productive taxpayers would far outweigh the temporary loss of revenue from Lin's Jeshuayu. The Minister of Finance, acting on Guo Kai's data, convinced the emperor to issue an unprecedented edict. The tax quota for the Liangzhou region was to be reduced by half for the year. Furthermore, emergency grain from the imperial granaries was to be released to the region, not as a handout, but as a repayable loan to the most vulnerable families. It was a victory not just for Guo Kai and the people of Liangzhou, but for the very idea that bureaucracy could be a force for good. The famine was not averted completely. Some still suffered and died, but it was mitigated significantly. The social fabric of the region, which would have surely unraveled under the pressure of a full tax burden, remained intact. Guo Kai's simple act of adding a few extra lines to his ledgers had prevented a major rebellion and saved countless lives. But what was the long-term impact of his actions? Did his humanistic approach change the way the Han dynasty governed, or was it a one-time anomaly? The story of Guo Kai and the Liangzhou famine might have been just another forgotten footnote. In the vast history of the Han dynasty, were it not for its lasting impact on imperial policy. The success of his pragmatic approach was not lost on the Minister of Finance. The minister, a hard-nosed pragmatist, saw in Guokai's actions a powerful model for effective governance. He realized that a rigid, one-size-fits-all tax policy was not only cruel but also fiscally unsound. It led to famines, rebellions, and ultimately a loss of revenue and control following the Liangzhou incident. The Minister of Finance issued a directive to all provincial tax collectors. It was a remarkable document that mandated a subtle but profound change in procedure. Tax collectors were now required to do more than just record figures. They were ordered to include detailed contextual notes on their ledgers. They had to document not only the harvest yield but also the weather conditions, any local calamities such as floods or pestilence, and the general well-being of the populace. This change, inspired directly by Guokai's innovative practice, transformed the role of the tax collector from a simple auditor into a kind of field-based socioeconomic observer. This new policy had a far-reaching effect on the Han Dynasty. It created a feedback loop between the central government and the local populace, allowing for a more nuanced and responsive approach to governance. The imperial court, for the first time, had a more accurate picture of the on-the-ground reality of its vast empire. When a region reported a poor harvest, the government could verify the claim against the documented weather conditions and other factors, making it harder for corrupt officials to cheat the system. More importantly, it allowed the state to respond to localized crises before they spiraled into full-blown rebellions. Guokai himself was promoted to a higher-ranking position, not in the central court, but as a regional supervisor, where he could train other tax collectors in his methods. He became a living example of a new kind of civil servant, one who was not just an enforcer of the law, but an agent of its just application. His simple act of adding notes to a ledger helped institutionalize a more humane and practical form of governance that would influence Chinese administration for centuries to come. The legacy of the humble Han tax collector, and of Guokai in particular, reminds us that the power of a government isn't just in its ability to command, but in its capacity to listen and adapt. The history of the Han Dynasty is filled with tales of emperors and generals, but the true story of its stability and resilience is also found in the quiet, dusty room of a provincial tax collector, where a man with a brush and bamboo slips decided that the well-being of his people was more important than a simple number on a ledger. It is a testament to the fact that boring bureaucracy, when done with integrity and empathy, can be the most powerful force for change. Settle in and let us embark on a journey that begins not with a king, a battle, or a great invention, but with a simple, unassuming substance: bird droppings. For centuries, Guanatha accumulated excrement of seabirds, and bats was just a curiosity found on remote, arid islands. But in the 19th century, this organic fertilizer became one of the most sought-after commodities on Earth, sparking a global scramble that reshaped economies, fueled industrial revolutions, and even led to wars. This is the boring, but remarkably significant story of the global guano trade. The world of the early 19th century was on the cusp of a dramatic change. The Industrial Revolution, already in full swing, was creating a new class of urban dwellers. The demand for food was skyrocketing, but agriculture was still rooted in age-old practices. Farmers relied on crop rotation and animal manure, but these methods were slow and inefficient. The soil of Europe, after centuries of intense farming, was becoming depleted. Crop yields were stagnant, and the looming threat of mass starvation was a real concern for many nations. This is where guano enters the picture. While it had been used for centuries by indigenous peoples in Peru and other coastal regions as a potent fertilizer, its properties were largely unknown to the rest of the world. That changed in the 1840s. Published his groundbreaking work on plant nutrition. He demonstrated that plants required specific minerals, particularly nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, to grow. He also showed that guano was a concentrated source of these very nutrients. This wasn't just a good fertilizer. It was a miracle fertilizer. A few pounds of guano could do what a ton of animal manure could not. The discovery sent a shockwave through the agricultural world. Suddenly, farmers, industrialists, and governments were all clamoring for this white, foul-smelling substance. The most significant deposits of high-quality guano were found on a group of small, barren islands off the coast of Peru, particularly the Chincha Islands. The Chincha Islands were not much to look at. They were treeless, rocky outcroppings covered in millions of years' worth of seabird guano, in some places reaching depths of over 100 feet. It was a vast, smelly, and incredibly valuable mountain of treasure. The Peruvian government, which had long seen the guano as an inconvenient mess, suddenly found itself sitting on a natural resource more valuable than gold. State monopoly on guano extraction, a decision that would make and break fortunes. The demand from Europe, particularly from Great Britain and France, was insatiable. Ships from around the world converged on the Chincha Islands, creating a bustling, chaotic port where thousands of workers, mostly Chinese coolies and impoverished South American laborers, toiled in brutal conditions to shovel and bag the guano. The work was horrendous. The air was thick with dust and the stench of ammonia. The workers, often treated little better than slaves, would spend their days hacking at the hardened guano with picks and shovels, loading it into sacks, and then carrying the heavy bags to the waiting ships. The fine guano dust was a constant irritant, causing respiratory problems and other illnesses, but the money was too good to ignore. The guano trade became the lifeblood of the Peruvian economy, financing a brief period of immense wealth for the country. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. As much as 400,000 tons of guano were being exported annually by the mid-1850s. This influx of fertilizer fundamentally changed agriculture in Europe and North America. Crop yields soared. Land that was once considered barren became productive. It was the driving force behind a new age of intensive, scientific farming. The agricultural revolution, which had been a slow, evolutionary process, was suddenly turbocharged by a single, potent substance. But as with all valuable resources, the scramble for guano was not without conflict. Other nations, eager to get in on the action, began to search for their own deposits. This led to a peculiar, forgotten chapter of colonial expansion, the annexation of remote, uninhabited islands. The United States, in particular, passed the Guano Islands Act of 1856, which allowed American citizens to claim any uninhabited island with guano deposits for the United States. This boring-sounding law led to the American colonization of dozens of tiny islands and atolls throughout the Pacific and Caribbean. The British, Germans, and other European powers were also engaged in a similar race. The global guano rush was in full swing, turning a pile of droppings into a geopolitical flashpoint. But what would happen when the Chincha Islands' seemingly endless supply of guano began to run out? And what did this obsession with a natural fertilizer reveal about the inner workings of empires and economies? The guano trade was a perfect example of a boom-and-bust cycle. The initial frenzy was driven by a belief that the supply was virtually limitless. After all, the Chincha Islands were covered in a seemingly endless mountain of the stuff accumulated over millennia. But the speed and scale of the extraction were far greater than anyone had anticipated. The vast, layered deposits of guano were not being replenished at the rate they were being harvested. The seabirds, a significant part of the ecosystem, had been largely driven away by the constant noise and human activity. The end was in sight, and the scramble became even more desperate. The Peruvian government, having grown dependent on the immense revenue from the guano monopoly, began to face a new reality. The easy-to-access, high-quality guano was running out. They started looking for new sources, leading to exploration of other islands and coastal areas. This search, however, was not without conflict. Spain, a former colonial power, saw Peru's guano wealth as an affront and a source of potential leverage. In 1864, under a pretext of a diplomatic dispute, Spain seized the Chincha Islands. This bizarre act of colonial aggression over a pile of bird droppings led to the Chincha Islands War between Spain and a coalition of South American nations, including Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia. The war, a forgotten footnote in military history, was a direct consequence of the global obsession. With this potent fertilizer, the war highlighted the geopolitical significance of guano. It wasn't just a commodity. It was a strategic resource, a fundamental component of the new industrial and agricultural age. For a time, control of a guano deposit was as important as control of a coal mine or an oil field. The conflict eventually ended with Spain withdrawing, but it was a clear warning that the world's dependence on this resource was unstable. Meanwhile, the other nations that had passed their own guano acts and claimed uninhabited islands found that their deposits were of a lower quality than those from Peru. The unique climate of the Chincha Islands, with its lack of rain, had preserved the nitrogen content in a way that was unmatched elsewhere. This created a new kind of competition, a quality-driven market. The guano from Peru was the gold standard, and every other nation's guano was a lesser substitute. This period of resource scarcity and conflict led to an interesting side effect: a renewed interest in scientific agriculture. Scientists and chemists, realizing the finite nature of guano, began to search for a synthetic alternative. This quest was not driven by pure scientific curiosity, but by the very real fear of a global food crisis. The German scientist Karl Sprengel, a contemporary of Liebig, had already theorized about the importance of nitrogen and its role in plant growth. The guano crisis put a newfound urgency on this research. The global guano rush was an absurd, fascinating story of an entire world being turned upside down by something so mundane. It fueled the growth of industrialized agriculture and led to wars, colonial expansion, and immense wealth for a handful of nations. But its most important legacy might not have been what it provided, but what its eventual scarcity inspired. The world was on the cusp of a new agricultural revolution, but this one would not be based on a natural resource. It would be based on human ingenuity, a quest to replicate what nature provided in a pile of droppings. How did the world solve the problem of a finite guano supply? And how did this seemingly boring crisis lead to a new era of scientific discovery that would change the course of human history forever? The world solved its guano problem through a combination of scientific ingenuity and a persistent search for a new, more sustainable source of fertilizer. The decline of the Chincha Islands deposits and the resulting geopolitical conflicts created a powerful incentive for chemists and engineers to find a solution. The search for a synthetic alternative, which had been a low-priority academic pursuit, suddenly became a global economic imperative. This quest culminated in one of the most significant, yet often overlooked, scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century, the Haber-Bosch process. In the early 1900s, two German chemists, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, developed a method to synthesize ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. The air we breathe is roughly 78% nitrogen, but this nitrogen is in a form that plants cannot directly absorb. The Haber-Bosch process used high pressure and temperature to fix this atmospheric nitrogen. The production of food was no longer dependent on a finite natural resource like guano or a time-consuming natural process like crop rotation. Haber-Bosch process effectively ended the global guano trade. The demand for the stinky, dusty bird droppings evaporated almost overnight. The remote islands that were once sites of brutal labor and geopolitical conflict were abandoned. Their brief moment of immense wealth and strategic importance over the legacy of the guano rush is more than just a peculiar historical anecdote. It represents a critical inflection point in the relationship between humanity and its food supply. The crisis it created forced a shift from a reactive, resource-based approach to a proactive, scientific one. The Haber-Bosch process, born from the need to replace guano, has been credited with feeding billions of people and preventing widespread famine. It is estimated that a significant portion of the world's population is alive today because of the food produced with synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. The story of guano is a testament to the fact that even the most mundane and seemingly disgusting substances can shape the course of history. It's a reminder that great scientific breakthroughs are often spurred not by pure curiosity, but by a very real and often boring logistical problem. The global scramble for bird droppings led directly to the invention that now sustains modern agriculture. Transformative solution. Let's shift our focus to the vast and complex world of the Ottoman Empire, not to its grand conquests or intricate court politics, but to a seemingly trivial item of daily life, the humble cabbage. In the 16th century, the Ottoman state, like all great empires, faced the monumental challenge of feeding its capital. Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, a city of hundreds of thousands of people. This was a logistical puzzle of epic proportions, and its solution lay in a system of rigorous food regulation and a surprisingly complex supply chain. Empire's approach to food security was a model of centralized control. The state maintained a system known as nar, which set fixed prices for all essential goods, from bread and meat to yes, vegetables. The goal was to prevent price gouging and ensure that even the poorest citizen could afford to eat. This was seen as a moral duty of the Sultan and a critical element of social stability. The system was enforced by an army of inspectors, the mutasib, who patrolled the markets. Cabbage, though not a luxury item, was a staple of the Ottoman diet, particularly in the winter months when other vegetables were scarce. It was easy to grow, could be stored for long periods, and was used in countless dishes, from stews to pickles. The supply chain for Constantinople's cabbages was a finely tuned operation. They were grown in the fertile plains of Thrace, the region west of the city, and transported by ox cart and small ships across the Sea of Marmara. Every part of this journey was regulated, from the route the carts took to the maximum weight they could carry. The state's obsession with order meant that the process was both efficient and incredibly rigid. Our story's protagonist is Ahmed, a mid-level bureaucrat in the Office of Imperial Provisions. His job was the epitome of administrative drudgery. He was responsible for monitoring the cabbage supply from the Thracian farms to the markets of Constantinople. His days were spent poring over ledgers, calculating yields, and writing memos. On the projected harvest, it was a boring job, but one that was absolutely vital to the city's well-being. In the summer of 1582, the harvest reports from Thrace were coming in lower than expected. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but they were consistently below the average yield. He initially dismissed it as a minor fluctuation, a result of less than ideal weather. But as the season progressed, the reports worsened. The farmers were blaming a new, fast-spreading blight that was withering the cabbage leaves before they could fully mature. Ahmed, being a cautious man, immediately filed a report with his superiors. The response was a typical example of bureaucratic inertia. He was told that the issue was a local problem and that the imperial quota must still be met. The central government's mindset was rigid. The quotas were set, and it was the responsibility of the provincial administrators to meet them. The idea that a simple agricultural problem could disrupt the empire's food supply was almost unthinkable. They were more concerned with the paperwork than with the reality on the ground. The situation spiraled. The farmers, unable to meet the quota, began to hide a portion of their diminished harvest for their own families, creating a black market for cabbages. The price, which was supposed to be fixed, began to rise in the unofficial markets. The mutasib in Constantinople, finding a shortage of cabbages in the official stalls, blamed the merchants for hoarding. The merchants, in turn, blamed the farmers. The system was seizing up all over a vegetable. The problem wasn't a shortage of cabbages. It was a shortage of information and flexibility. The rigid top-down system was incapable of responding to a minor but significant disruption at its source. The situation was about to become a full-blown crisis, threatening the social order of the capital itself. What would happen when the people of Constantinople discovered that their trusted food supply was failing? And how would a minor bureaucratic blip become a major source of urban discontent? The first sign of the growing crisis was the disappearance of cabbage from the city's official markets. This was a direct challenge to the state's authority. The Ottoman government, steeped in a tradition of paternalistic rule, saw the orderly supply of food as a core component of its social contract with the people. A hungry populace was a dangerous populace. The initial response from the central Government was one of denial and misplaced blame. The Grand Vizier, a man more accustomed to military campaigns than agricultural logistics, issued a stern decree threatening severe punishment for any merchant found to be hoarding cabbages. This only exacerbated the problem. Merchants, fearing arrest, stopped selling what little supply they had, driving the prices even higher in the black market. The system, designed to prevent price manipulation, was now causing it. Our hero, Ahmed, the diligent bureaucrat, was caught in the middle. His reports, which had long warned of the supply chain issues, were now being dismissed as alarmist. However, refused to simply rubber stamp the official narrative. He knew the problem wasn't hoarding. It was a fundamental supply issue caused by a crop blight. In a quiet act of bureaucratic courage, he sent a low-level clerk to Thrace to investigate the situation firsthand. Bypassing the official channels, the clerk, posing as a merchant, confirmed Ahmed's suspicions. The fields were indeed blighted, and the farmers, facing ruin, were hoarding their own produce for survival. The system of quotas, fixed prices, and rigid enforcement was completely unsuited for an unforeseen natural disaster. The elegant simplicity of the Ottoman food supply chain had become its greatest weakness. Armed with this new, a detailed narrative of the social and economic consequences, he described the fear of the farmers, the desperation of the merchants. He made a clear and compelling argument. The state needed to suspend the quotas, provide financial relief to the farmers, and allow prices to fluctuate temporarily in order to stabilize the market. It was a radical idea that went against centuries of Ottoman administrative tradition. His report was a bombshell. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the Grand Vizier and the rigid administrative structure of the empire. It was an admission that the all-knowing, all-powerful state did not, in fact, know everything. The Grand Vizier was furious. He saw the report as an act of insubordination. He ordered Ahmed to be arrested for spreading rumors and causing public panic. The stage was set for a classic confrontation between rigid authority and on-the-ground reality. Would Ahmed's data-driven, practical approach be enough to save him and the city from a crisis of its own making? The arrest of Ahmed, a diligent but low-ranking bureaucrat, seemed to be the end of the matter. The Grand Vizier, having asserted his authority, believed the problem would simply go away. He was wrong. The public, already growing anxious over the rising cost of food, saw Ahmed's arrest not as an act of justice, but as proof that the government was trying to hide a problem. Rumors, far more damaging than any official report, began to circulate. The whispers in the market stalls and public baths turned into open discontent. A minor bureaucratic dispute had now become a matter of public trust. The crisis came to a head when a small but vocal group of merchants and farmers, emboldened by Ahmed's stance, petitioned the Sultan directly. They bypassed the Grand Vizier and presented their case using Ahmed's reports as evidence. They argued that the problem was not one of corruption, but of a flawed system that was unresponsive to the realities of farming. The Sultan, a man with a keen sense of political survival, understood the danger of a hungry populace. He ordered a secret investigation, and the findings of his own trusted officials confirmed everything Ahmed had reported. The cabbage blight was real, the farmers were suffering, and the rigid system was indeed to blame. In a stunning reversal, the Grand Vizier was removed from his post for his incompetence. Ahmed, who was still in prison, was released and publicly exonerated. He was not only reinstated, but was also given a new senior position in a newly created office dedicated to agricultural and food supply logistics. This new office, directly reporting to the Sultan, was given the authority to make on-the-ground adjustments to food quotas and prices in times of crisis. A radical departure from the old, rigid system. The cabbage crisis became a quiet but powerful lesson for the Ottoman government. It taught them that a rigid, top-down bureaucratic system was ill-suited for the complex and unpredictable nature of a vast empire's food supply. The incident led to a more flexible and responsive system of food regulation. Local officials were given more autonomy to adjust prices and quotas based on local conditions, and a new emphasis was placed on gathering accurate, real-time data from the farms. The humble cabbage, a symbol of a minor bureaucratic failure, had forced a major reform in imperial policy. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire's cabbage crisis is not a grand battle or a political coup, but a subtle shift in the philosophy of governance. It is a testament to the fact that even the most seemingly insignificant details, the health of a vegetable crop, can have a profound impact on the stability of an empire. It shows that a government's strength lies not just in its ability to command, but in its ability to adapt and respond to the mundane realities of daily life. Let us now travel to a very different kind of empire, the vast, horse-powered world of the Mongols. While we often think of the Mongol Empire in terms of its military conquests, stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, its success was built on a foundation of communication. The largest contiguous land empire in history was held together, not just by force, but by a sophisticated and surprisingly boring logistical system known as the Mongol Postal Relay System. This is the story of the foot soldiers of this system, the Mongol mail carriers, and their difficult, dangerous, and utterly unglamorous lives. The Mongol Empire was a world without paved roads or telegraphs. News and orders had to travel by muscle and grit. The Yam was a network of relay stations, also called Yam, spaced approximately 20 to 30 miles apart. At each station, fresh horses were kept ready, along with provisions and, most importantly, a new rider. This system allowed for a messenger to travel at incredible speeds, covering up to 200 miles a day. It was the information superhighway of its time. Our story's protagonist is a young Mongol rider named Temujin. He was not a warrior, he was a Yam messenger. His job was a monotonous cycle of riding, resting, and relaying messages. His world was one of wind-swept steppes, bone-chilling cold, and the constant rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves. For the messenger, the journey was everything. A document with the emperor's seal had to be delivered on time, no matter the weather, the terrain, or the dangers. The penalty for failure was severe. Temujin's daily life was a testament to the sheer physical and mental endurance required for the job. He carried a small leather satchel with the imperial message and a special tablet, a peza, that marked him as an official messenger of the Great Khan. The peza was his key to the network. It granted him the right to fresh horses, food, and shelter at any Yam station. The work was relentlessly lonely. A rider would often spend hours, or even days, alone on the vast steppe, with only his horse for company. The dangers were numerous. The weather could turn in an instant. A sunny day giving way to a blinding blizzard. There were rivers to ford, and mountains to cross, often without the benefit of a clear path. Bandits, though rare within the core of the empire, were still a threat. Temujin was not a warrior, and his only protection was the speed of his horse and the authority of his pesa. The most interesting aspect of the Yam system was the subtle politics and human drama that played out at the relay stations. The station masters, known as Yamchen, were a powerful and often corrupt lot. Their stations were the only source of food and shelter for a rider, and they held immense power. A late delivery could be blamed on a lazy horse or a slow station master, and the truth was often difficult to prove. Temujin and riders like him had to navigate this delicate social ecosystem. A simple argument over a horse could result in a delay that could cost a man his life. The messages themselves were often mundane, orders for provincial governors, census data, or news of a new tax, but sometimes they carried information of immense consequence. A message could contain the news of a new Khan's succession, or the order to assemble an army. The fate of an empire could literally rest in a small, sealed leather satchel. Temujin, a man with no political power of his own, was a vital, unappreciated cog in the great machinery of Mongol rule. His life was a perpetual motion machine, a testament to the raw logistics that held an empire together. But what would happen when a message of critical importance was delayed by a local dispute, forcing a young rider to choose between imperial law and his own survival? The efficiency of the Yam system depended on the seamless transfer of a message from one rider to the next. The system was designed for speed, not for comfort. A rider like Temujin would arrive at a station, hand over the message, grab a fresh horse, and be on his way, often within minutes. This perpetual motion, however, was about to be interrupted by a quiet act of defiance. Temujin arrived at a remote Yam station after a long day of riding. He was exhausted, cold, and hungry. He carried a message of critical importance, an order for a regional commander to move his troops to suppress a brewing rebellion. The message was time-sensitive, and any delay could have significant military consequences. He presented his paisa to the station master, a burly, jaded man named Batcher. To Temujin's surprise, Batcher refused to provide him with a fresh horse. The reason was simple and infuriatingly mundane. A group of local officials, visiting the station for a hunting trip, had claimed the best horses for their own use, leaving only a few weak, half-starved animals for the mail carriers. Batcher, intimidated by the officials and eager to curry favor, had simply given in to their demands. Temujin argued, citing the imperial decree that a Yam messenger's needs superseded all others. Batcher, however, was unmoved. "The Khan's word is a fine thing in the capital," he said with a smirk, "but here, my word is what matters. Take the horse I give you, or do not ride at all." This was a direct violation of the Yam protocol and a classic example of the corruption that plagued the lower rungs of the Mongol bureaucracy. Batcher's disregard for the system was a small act of personal gain, but it had the potential for vast repercussions. Temujin was faced with a stark choice. He could take a weak horse, knowing that it would slow him down and likely cause a fatal delay in the message's delivery, or he could stand his ground, a move that could lead to a physical confrontation and further delay. He decided to stand his ground. He knew the importance of the message he carried. He refused the horse and demanded to speak with the officials directly. They dismissed him as a mere servant. The standoff escalated. Batcher, worried about the potential fallout, threatened to report Temujin for insubordination. Temujin, however, made a bold move. He demanded that Batcher sign a document certifying that he had refused to provide a proper horse, and that the delay was due to the station master's failure to follow imperial law. Batcher, confident in his local power, signed the document, believing he was incriminating Temujin. He was wrong. Temujin, with the signed document in hand, took the best horse he could find and rode off, leaving the officials and Batcher in a cloud of dust. He knew he was now in deep trouble with the station master, but he also had the proof he needed to clear his own name. He rode through the night, pushing the horse and himself to their limits. He arrived at the next station just in time to hand off the message. The relay continued, and the message reached its destination, allowing the commander to act and suppress the rebellion. Temujin's story highlights a critical vulnerability in the Mongol Empire's communication network, the human element. The system was only as strong as its weakest link. A single act of greed by a minor official could have undermined a military campaign, but it also showed the resilience of the system and the integrity of a single individual. The story of Temujin and his fight with Batcher would eventually make its way back to the capital, bringing to light the quiet, persistent corruption that was undermining the empire from within. What would be the fate of Temujin, and how would his seemingly minor act of defiance lead to a major reform in the most important logistical system of the Mongol Empire? The Mongol Empire, for all its immense power, was a surprisingly responsive bureaucracy, particularly when it came to the efficiency of its communication network. The signed document from the station master, Batcher, proved to be Temujin's saving grace. When he handed it over at the next Yam station, the new rider, who understood the gravity of the situation, immediately filed a report with his superiors, noting the delay and the signed confession of the station master. This report, along with the news that the message had, in fact, reached its destination just in time, traveled up the chain of command. The incident was brought to the attention of the Great Khan, who was infuriated. He understood that Batcher's petty greed was a far greater threat to the empire than a minor rebellion. It was a sign of a rot within the system, a creeping corruption that could, over time, undermine the very foundation of Mongol rule. The Yam was a system built on trust and ruthless efficiency. Any compromise of that efficiency was a direct challenge to the Khan's authority. The punishment was swift and severe. Batcher was stripped of his position and exiled. His punishment was not for the delay itself, but for the violation of the imperial decree and his blatant disregard for the sanctity of the Yam system. Temujin, the humble messenger, was hailed as a hero. His honesty and bravery were used as a model for all other Yam messengers. He was not promoted to a higher-ranking position, but his story was circulated throughout the empire as a cautionary tale for corrupt officials and an inspiration for dedicated workers. The incident led to a significant reform of the Yam system. New, stricter regulations were put in place. The authority of the Yamchen was curtailed, and more power was given to the riders themselves to report any infractions. Inspectors from the central government were sent out on the routes to ensure compliance. The Great Khan's message was clear. No local lord or official was above the needs of the empire's communication network. The lesson was a powerful one. The power of the Mongol Empire lay not just in its formidable army, but in its ability to send and receive messages with ruthless speed and efficiency. The legacy of the Mongol Yam system and the story of Temujin lies in the triumph of logistics over local corruption. It is a testament to the fact that the most impressive achievements of an empire are often built on the backs of its most humble servants. The silent, unglamorous work of a mail carrier ensured that the vast, sprawling empire remained connected and responsive. It's a reminder that sometimes the true story of history is found not in the great battles, but in the mundane, boring, and utterly essential details of daily life. Let us journey now to a world of intricate court politics and deep-seated superstition, medieval Korea. During the Goryeo and early Joseon dynasties, while we often think of these periods in terms of grand philosophical debates or military conflicts, a far more subtle and terrifying force shaped the lives of the elite, red ink. This is the story of how a mundane administrative tool became a symbol of a fearsome power, and why a simple mark on a document could send shivers down the spine of even the most powerful bureaucrat in the highly centralized and hierarchical society of medieval Korea. All official documents from tax records to appointments to judicial verdicts were handwritten. The process was a rigorous, multi-step affair involving scribes, clerks, and high-ranking officials. Documents would be drafted in black ink, the standard for all writing. But for a document to be truly official, to carry the full weight of imperial authority, it needed to be stamped with a specific seal. These seals, often made of jade or bronze, were invariably applied with red ink. The most powerful of these was the Great Imperial Seal, a massive, ornate stamp that represented the ultimate authority of the king. Red ink, or jusa, was not just a color. It was a substance imbued with a powerful symbolism in East Asian culture. Red was associated with life, fire, and the warding off of evil spirits. It was used to write talismans and to mark the entrances to homes during festivals. The act of stamping a document with red ink was not merely a bureaucratic formality. It was a magical act, a way of imbuing the document with the power of the state and the protection of the heavens. It was believed that the red ink, applied by the king, had the power to bind a decision to the spiritual realm, making it an immutable and sacred decree. But this power had a darker side. A bureaucrat's life was a delicate dance of political maneuvering and meticulous paperwork. A single mistake, a miscalculation of tax, a wrong date, or a poorly worded phrase could lead to ruin. The official documents were not just records. They were a binding contract with the state and, by extension, the spiritual forces that the red ink symbolized. A minor error, once stamped with the imperial seal, was no longer a simple mistake. It was an act of administrative heresy, a stain on the sacred order. Our protagonist is a young, ambitious scholar named Yi Jin. He had just secured his first major appointment in the Ministry of Taxation. He was known for his sharp mind and his meticulous attention to detail. His days were spent in a windowless room, surrounded by piles of tax records, calculating the grain quotas for distant provinces. He was a new cog in a very old machine. He had been taught that his work was not just about numbers, but about the very moral foundation of the empire. He was part of a system that, on paper, was flawless. His first major assignment was to review and prepare a series of provincial tax reports for final approval. He meticulously went through each one, checking every number, every character. He was taught to look for errors, and he was proud of his ability to find them. He corrected dozens of minor mistakes in black ink, writing a small note in the margin. But there was one report that troubled him. It was a request for a tax reduction for a province that had suffered a minor flood. The numbers were technically correct, but the request was deemed too lenient by his superiors, who worried it would set a precedent. The report was sent back to him with a note instructing him to revise the figures. Yi Jin, faced with a moral and professional dilemma, knew that the original report was just, but he also knew that his superiors expected him to change it. He was a new bureaucrat, and to refuse would be a career-ending move. He reluctantly made the changes, inflating the tax quota, and sent the report back up the chain of command. Few days later, the report returned, this time with the massive, brilliant red stamp of the great imperial seal at its head. The decision was now final. The inflated tax quota was now a sacred decree. But what would happen when the consequences of that flawed, red ink decision came to light? And how would a simple mark on a document haunt a young bureaucrat's conscience and threaten his very existence? Yi Jin's decision to revise the tax report haunted him. He knew the inflated quota would be a severe burden on the already struggling province, a burden he had knowingly imposed. But the document, now bearing the imperial seal in brilliant red ink, was immutable. It was a final, unchangeable command. From the heavens, the fear of red ink was not just a superstition. It was a deeply ingrained administrative reality. A decision made in black ink could be debated, revised, and even overturned. A decision stamped in red ink was a final verdict, a sacred decree. To defy it was to defy the king, the state, and the very cosmos. A few months later, news from the affected province of Jela began to trickle into the capital. The harvest, already poor due to the floods, was insufficient to meet the new, inflated tax quota. The farmers, already living on the edge of survival, were being pushed into ruin. The local administrators, faced with the impossible task of collecting grain that didn't exist, were resorting to desperate measures, seizing livestock and personal belongings. This was exactly what Yi Jin had feared. The situation, a minor administrative issue on paper, was spiraling into a social crisis. Yi Jin found himself in a state of profound moral conflict. He was a new bureaucrat, and to speak out against a decision that had received the imperial seal was an act of career suicide, if not treason. He was a small cog in a giant machine, and he knew that his individual conscience mattered little to the grand workings of the state. He tried to ignore the news from Jela, burying himself in new piles of paperwork, but the memory of the red ink burned in his mind. The red stamp, once a symbol of imperial authority, now felt like a curse, a direct and personal condemnation of his moral cowardice. The whispers in the capital grew. The officials who had pushed for the inflated tax quota now began to blame the local administrators for the crisis. They argued that the Jela officials were corrupt or incompetent, unable to handle their duties. This was a common tactic in the Hosan court to deflect blame downwards. Yi Jin, watching this unfold, felt a cold dread. He was a witness to a lie, a lie he had helped create. He knew that the local officials were not corrupt. They were simply trying to enforce an impossible decree. The situation came to a head when a small delegation of scholars from the Jela province arrived in the capital. They were not farmers, but educated men, and they had come to petition the king directly. They presented their case with eloquent detail, describing the suffering of the people. They argued that the tax quota was not only unjust, but impossible to meet. The Grand Tribunal, a body of high-ranking officials, was convened to hear their petition. The scholars' case was strong, but the official document, the one with the red stamp, was a powerful piece of counter-evidence. The Grand Tribunal was loath to admit that a decision stamped by the king was flawed. Yi Jin, a junior clerk, was a ghost in the background of this grand drama. He was a witness to the injustice, but he had no voice, no power. The red ink, a symbol of absolute power and legitimacy, was being used to defend a flawed decision and to condemn a group of honest people. The fear of that mark was a powerful tool of control, a way of silencing dissent and preserving the illusion of bureaucratic perfection. But how could this illusion be broken? How could a young, powerless bureaucrat expose the truth and challenge the absolute authority of the red ink? Eugene knew he couldn't challenge the red ink directly. That was an act of treason. Instead, he chose a more subtle, but equally dangerous, path. He decided to use the very tools of bureaucracy to expose the truth. He spent days in the ministry's archives, meticulously cross-referencing the official tax report with other documents, weather records, local harvest reports, and correspondence from the Jela provincial government. He found a damning pattern. The official report was an anomaly. Every other piece of data, from his own early assessments to the reports from his colleagues, showed a poor harvest. The inflated tax quota was a fabricated number, a lie that had been sanctioned by the Grand Tribunal and sealed with red ink. Armed with this evidence, he did not petition the king or write a public denunciation. Instead, he presented his findings to a trusted high-ranking censor in the censorate, an office responsible for investigating official misconduct. He presented a new kind of case, a case not against a person, but against a document. He argued that the official record, despite its red ink stamp, was fundamentally flawed because it was based on inaccurate data. It was not a legal or moral argument, but a logistical and administrative one. The censor, a man who valued truth and bureaucratic integrity, was shocked. He had never seen a case like this. The argument was simple. The red ink, the symbol of absolute truth, had been applied to a lie. The censor took the case to the king, not as a matter of injustice, but as a matter of administrative purity. He argued that if a document could be stamped with the imperial seal based on false information, then the entire system was at risk. The king's authority was not just in his power to command, but in his ability to command truthfully. The king was deeply disturbed by this revelation. The red ink was a powerful symbol, and the idea that its power had been used to sanction a falsehood was a grave offense. He ordered a full review of the case. The Grand Tribunal was forced to re-examine the evidence. Faced with Yi Jin's meticulous documentation and the censorate's investigation, they had no choice but to admit their error. The inflated tax quota was officially reversed, and the Jela province was granted the relief it had initially requested. Yi Jin was not publicly hailed as a hero. His actions were kept quiet, to avoid embarrassing the powerful officials who had made the initial decision. But his reputation as a man of integrity and meticulousness spread throughout the bureaucracy. The incident led to a subtle but significant change in how official documents were handled. From then on, officials were even more terrified of red ink, but for a different reason. They were not afraid of its power, but of its unforgiving finality. They learned that a mistake sealed with red ink could not be undone, and that they, as administrators, were ultimately responsible for the truthfulness of the documents they prepared. The red ink, a symbol of authority, had now become a powerful enforcer of administrative honesty. The story of the red ink and the terrified bureaucrats is a quiet testament to the power of a single individual to use the very system that oppresses him to expose its flaws. It's a reminder that even in a world of rigid hierarchy and deep-seated superstition, a simple commitment to truth and fact can be a revolutionary act. The red ink, once a symbol of an administrative curse, became a symbol of accountability. Let us turn our attention now to an empire of immense bureaucracy and economic control. The Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644. While we often focus on the grandeur of the Forbidden City or the voyages of Zheng He, the real story of the empire's power and its fragility can be found in a single vital commodity: salt. This is the story of how the state's rigid monopoly on salt production and distribution gave rise to a sprawling network of smugglers, an underground economy, and a continuous low-grade conflict that shaped daily life and imperial policy. For the Ming state, salt was not just a seasoning, it was a fundamental pillar of its fiscal policy. The government held an absolute monopoly on salt, controlling its production, transport, and sale. The system, known as the Yanfa, was a marvel of bureaucratic control. Salt was produced in state-owned salterns along the coast, then distributed to licensed merchants who were given a quota to sell in a specific region. The revenue from the salt tax was a massive and reliable source of income for the imperial treasury, funding everything from the army to the construction of public works. The system's rigidity, however, was also its greatest weakness. The state set the price of salt artificially high, ensuring a steady stream of revenue. But for the vast majority of the population, particularly the poor, the price was a heavy burden. This created a powerful economic incentive for illegal activity. Salt smuggling, or xianzu, became a pervasive and lucrative business. The smugglers were not a single organized crime syndicate, but a diverse group of individuals: disgruntled former soldiers, impoverished peasants, and small-time merchants looking to bypass the state's high prices. Our protagonist is a man named Lin Yi, a former soldier who, after being discharged, found himself unable to make ends meet. He lived in a remote village in the mountains of Sichuan, a region far from the coastal salterns. The officially sanctioned salt, transported over long distances, was prohibitively expensive in his village. Lin Yi, driven by a need to provide for his family, began a new, dangerous career as a salt smuggler. His operation was small, but representative of the larger network. He and his companions would buy salt from unofficial producers, or even steal it from state depots, and then transport it through treacherous mountain passes to sell at a lower price to local villages. The work was filled with immense risk. The state had an army of salt police, the Yanying, whose sole purpose was to hunt down and punish smugglers. The punishment for smuggling was severe, often involving hard labor or even execution. The smugglers had to be resourceful and creative. They learned to hide salt in false-bottomed carts, in sacks disguised as grain, and in hollowed-out gourds. They developed a network of secret routes and safe houses, creating a silent, unwritten map of the empire's underbelly. The conflict between the smugglers and the state was a continuous, low-grade war of attrition. The state would issue new decrees and increase the number of salt police. The smugglers would respond with new tactics and new routes. This was not a clash of grand armies, but a series of small, mundane battles over a sack of salt. The state, for all its immense power, was never able to fully stamp out the practice. The black market for salt was simply too large and too economically vital for the poor. Linier's most valuable asset was not his physical strength or cunning, but his intimate knowledge of the local terrain. He knew the hidden trails and the remote valleys where the salt police would not venture. He was a master of evasion, a ghost in the mountains. But this peaceful, illicit trade was about to be interrupted by a new, more ruthless salt police commander, a man determined to break the back of the smuggling network once and for all. What would happen when the quiet, boring conflict over salt escalated into a full-blown war? And how would a simple commodity come to symbolize a battle for economic justice and freedom? The Ming government, frustrated by the persistent smuggling problem, appointed a new commander of the salt police, a man named General Chen. Chen was a veteran of the frontier wars, a ruthless and pragmatic man who saw the smuggling network not as a criminal enterprise but as an enemy state. He was determined to apply military strategy to an administrative problem. He began by targeting the source of the smuggling, the salt smugglers themselves. He created a new, highly mobile force of salt police, trained to operate in the difficult mountain terrain and equipped with a new, ruthless set of tactics. Chen's strategy was not to patrol the main roads, but to hunt down the smugglers in their remote mountain strongholds. He offered large bounties for information and encouraged local informants to betray their neighbors. He also began a policy of collective punishment, threatening entire villages with starvation and destruction if they were found to be harboring smugglers. This was a direct assault on the smugglers' social network, a network built on trust and a shared sense of economic injustice. Lin Yi, our protagonist, found himself and his community under siege. The old, predictable routes were now patrolled by a more disciplined and relentless force. His fellow smugglers, once a tight-knit group, were now wary of each other, fearing betrayal. The risk was no longer just the loss of a shipment. It was the destruction of his entire village. He realized that a simple game of cat and mouse had become a war of attrition, and the state, with its immense resources, had the advantage. Lin Yi knew he could not win a direct confrontation. He had to change the rules of the game. He decided to exploit the very bureaucracy that was trying to destroy him. He realized that General Chun's tactics, while effective in the short term, were alienating the very people the state was supposed to govern. The collective punishment was creating widespread resentment and a new kind of social unrest. The people of the remote villages, who had once been neutral, now saw the state as a far greater threat than the smugglers. Lin Yi began to organize a new kind of smuggling operation, one that was less about profit and more about public relations. He and his group would leave small, free caches of salt in strategic locations, often in villages that had suffered under General Chen's harsh tactics. He also started to circulate pamphlets, written by a sympathetic scholar, that detailed the injustices of the salt monopoly and the brutality of the salt police. The pamphlets, though simple, were a powerful tool. They turned the salt smugglers from common criminals into folk heroes, and the salt police from enforcers of the law into agents of tyranny. This new strategy was a stroke of genius. General Chen, for all his military prowess, was completely unprepared for a war of public opinion. He could hunt down smugglers in the mountains, but he could not stop the spread of an idea. The number of informants dried up, and the people, once too afraid to speak, were now openly hostile to his forces. The conflict over salt had transcended a simple economic dispute and had become a battle for the hearts and minds of the people. The state's immense power was proving to be useless against a simple, well-crafted narrative. But how could Lin Yi, a simple smuggler, capitalize on this new advantage and use it to not only survive, but to force a fundamental change in the Ming Empire's rigid and unyielding salt policy? Lin Yi's ingenious use of public opinion turned the tide of the salt smuggling war. He had effectively transformed a local criminal problem into a widespread issue of social justice. The official reports from General Chen to the central government were no longer just about the number of smugglers caught. They now included alarming details about the growing hostility of the populace and the ineffectiveness of his brutal tactics. The court, far removed from the daily struggles of the common people, began to fear that the salt crisis could ignite a full-scale rebellion. The turning point came when a highly respected censor, a man tasked with rooting out government corruption, was sent to investigate the matter. The censor, a man of integrity, saw the situation for what it was. He understood that the problem was not a failure of law enforcement, but a failure of fiscal policy. He saw that the high price of state-monopolized salt was the root cause of the conflict. The smuggling was simply a symptom of a deeper problem. His report to the emperor was a damning indictment of the salt monopoly. He argued that the state's greed was not only harming its citizens, but was also creating social unrest and costing the government more in military and police resources than it was making in revenue. The emperor, faced with the undeniable evidence from a trusted official, was forced to act. General Chen was recalled from his post, his ruthless tactics having failed spectacularly. The salt tax was not eliminated, but it was reformed. The government lowered the price of state-sanctioned salt to a more reasonable level. While this cut into the emperor's revenue, it had the desired effect. The economic incentive for smuggling disappeared. The smugglers, including Lin Yi, found themselves with no market for their illegal goods. The salt smuggling network, a sprawling underground economy, simply melted away. The story of the Ming salt smugglers is a testament to the fact that economic forces can be more powerful than brute force. The Ming dynasty, with its vast military and bureaucracy, could not defeat the salt smugglers as long as the economic conditions were ripe for their existence. The victory was not won by soldiers or by a new law, but by a simple change in fiscal policy. It is a classic example of how a boring, mundane issue, like the price of a household staple, can have profound and lasting political consequences. The salt smugglers, who were never hailed as heroes in their own time, were the quiet agents of this change. A reminder that the most significant transformations in history are often driven by the small, everyday struggles of ordinary people. Let us travel now to the bustling, smog-filled world of Victorian London, a city at the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. In this era of incredible technological progress, one of the most pressing and unglamorous problems was the management of a city's most vital resource, water. The supply was not a public utility, but a fragmented, corrupt, and often dangerous network of private water companies. This is the story of how a seemingly minor dispute over the size of a water pipe spiraled into a major public scandal, exposing the city's deep-seated infrastructural flaws and forever changing its approach to public health. In the mid-19th century, London was a patchwork of competing water companies. The companies would lay their own pipes, draw water from the Thames, which was also the city's sewer, and sell it to houses and businesses. The system was a chaotic mess. Pipes were laid in a haphazard fashion, creating a confusing, inefficient network. The quality of the water was abysmal, filled with pollutants and disease-causing agents. The prices were high, and the service was unreliable. Our protagonist is a mild-mannered civil engineer named Thomas Newbold. He worked for the New River Company, one of London's largest and most powerful water companies. His job was to survey new pipe routes and to ensure that the pipes were laid according to the company's plans. It was a job filled with mundane details, endless paperwork, and the constant smell of damp earth and coal smoke. Newbold was a man of principles. He believed in doing his job correctly, not just to meet a company quota, but to ensure that the water supply, however flawed, was as reliable as possible. In 1844, he was given a contract to lay a new pipe to supply a rapidly growing district in central London. The contract stipulated that the pipe was to be a specific diameter, a crucial detail that determined the amount of water that could be supplied. When the shipment of pipes arrived, Newbold was immediately concerned. The pipes were of a smaller diameter than specified in the contract, a cost-cutting measure by a contractor who had a cozy relationship with Newbold's superiors. The difference in size was small, but it was significant. It meant that the new district would receive less water than they had paid for, and that the water pressure would be significantly lower, especially during peak usage. Newbold immediately filed a report, noting the discrepancy and advising that the smaller pipes should not be used. His superiors, however, were not interested in his professional opinion. They ordered him to proceed with the installation, arguing that the difference was negligible and that the public would never know. Newbold was faced with a stark choice. He could follow his orders and betray his principles, or he could refuse and risk his career. He chose to refuse, arguing that installing the pipes would be a dereliction of his duty as an engineer. His superiors, infuriated by his insubordination, dismissed him. Newbold, now out of a job, was not content to simply let the matter go. He knew the installation of the smaller pipes would create a serious problem in the future, and he had a professional and moral duty to speak out. He began to document his findings, meticulously gathering evidence. He collected samples of the smaller pipes, copied the original contract, and interviewed the workers who had been a part of the installation. He had a mountain of boring but crucial evidence. The question was, who would listen? What would happen when a seemingly minor dispute over pipe sizing became a full-blown public scandal? And how could a single, unemployed engineer bring a powerful water company to its knees? Thomas Newbold's lonely crusade against the New River Company was a testament to the power of one man armed with boring facts. He knew that the public and the press were far more interested in grand scandals than in technical disputes over pipe diameters. So he reframed his argument. He didn't talk about engineering specifications. He talked about the health and safety of Londoners. He argued that the smaller pipes were not just a breach of contract, but a public health threat. Lower water pressure meant that the new district would not have enough water to clean their homes, to fight fires, or, most importantly, to flush away waste. This was a language the public could understand, a fear they already lived with. He approached several London newspapers, including the Times, which was a powerful voice of public opinion. At first, they were hesitant. A story about a disgruntled engineer and a pipe dispute wasn't exactly a front-page sensation. But Newbold was persistent. He laid out his evidence with the precision of a lawyer and the clarity of a teacher. He showed them the original contract, the smaller pipes, and the calculations that proved the water pressure would be inadequate. He explained, in simple terms, how this would lead to a buildup of filth, a higher risk of cholera and other diseases, and a citywide health crisis. The editor of the Times, a man with a keen eye for a good story, saw the potential. This wasn't just a business dispute. It was a microcosm of London's larger infrastructural decay. It was a perfect symbol of corporate greed and public neglect. The Times ran a series of articles titled The Great Pipe Swindle, which detailed Newbold's accusations. They sensationalized the story, using dramatic language to describe how a powerful water company was risking the lives of thousands of Londoners to save a few pennies. The public reaction was immediate and furious. The New River Company tried to dismiss the accusations as the rantings of a disgruntled employee. They ran counter-advertisements in other newspapers, claiming that their pipes were more than adequate, was too compelling. The public, already suspicious of the water companies, saw the scandal as proof of their corruption and incompetence. The scandal became a major topic of debate in Parliament. The government, under pressure from the public and the press, was forced to act. A parliamentary committee was formed to investigate Newbold's claims. Newbold was called to testify. He presented his evidence with a quiet, dignified confidence. His testimony, filled with boring but undeniable facts and figures, was a powerful indictment of the entire system of private water companies. He didn't just expose a single act of fraud. He exposed a systemic failure. He argued that the only way to ensure the health and safety of London was to take the water supply out of the hands of private companies and place it under a single, accountable public authority. The scandal had accomplished what years of quiet lobbying and professional complaints had failed to do. It had brought the issue of London's water supply to the forefront of national attention. The dispute over a small pipe had revealed a gaping hole in the city's infrastructure and its governance. The question now was, would this scandal lead to a fundamental change in how London was governed? Or would it simply be another forgotten chapter in the city's chaotic history? The parliamentary investigation into the Great Pipe Swindle was a turning point for London's infrastructure. The committee, swayed by Thomas Newbold's detailed and undeniable testimony, released a damning report. It concluded that the private water companies were a hopeless and dangerous system that was completely unfit for the needs of a modern city. The report not only condemned the New River Company, but recommended a radical solution: the creation of a single public body to control London's entire water supply. The public outcry, fueled by the press, gave Parliament the political will to act. In 1848, a new law was passed that led to the eventual consolidation of all the private water companies into a single public entity, the Metropolitan Water Board. The board was given the authority to standardize pipe sizes to draw water from cleaner, more distant sources, and to ensure that the water was properly filtered and treated. It was a monumental shift in governance, a move from a chaotic, profit-driven system to a coordinated, public health-focused one. Thomas Newbold, the unemployed engineer who had started the whole thing, was offered a senior position in the new water board. He was a perfect fit for the job, a man who understood the intricate, boring details of civil engineering and who had the integrity to stand up for the public good. He became one of the key figures in the massive, decades-long project of rebuilding London's water supply, a project that would save countless lives from waterborne diseases. The Great London Water Board scandal is a fascinating example of how a seemingly insignificant administrative detail, the size of a pipe can, expose a fundamental flaw in a complex system. It shows that private greed and public neglect can create a crisis just as severe as a natural disaster or a military invasion. The scandal forced London to confront its own infrastructural decay and to make a fundamental change in how it governed its most vital resource. The legacy of the scandal is not a famous battle or a grand monument, but the vast, unseen network of pipes that still run under the streets of London today. It is a reminder that the health and well-being of a city depend on the boring, meticulous, and unglamorous work of civil engineers and honest bureaucrats. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most heroic act is simply to tell the truth and to stand your ground, no matter how insignificant the detail may seem. Let us now travel to a world of military discipline and bureaucratic precision, 18th and 19th century Prussia. While we often think of this state in terms of its formidable army and its grand strategic victories, the true story of its rise lies in a far more mundane and utterly boring concept: standardized time. This is the story of how a small, landlocked kingdom became a powerful empire, not through conquest alone, but through the obsessive, methodical application of punctuality and synchronized clocks. In the mid-18th century, Germany was a chaotic patchwork of hundreds of small states, each with its own local time. A traveler going from Berlin to Frankfurt might have to adjust his watch a dozen times. A minor inconvenience for a traveler, but a major logistical nightmare for a centralized state. The King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, and his successors understood that to build a powerful and efficient state, they needed to standardize more than just their laws. They needed to standardize time itself. The initial impetus was military. The Prussian army, with its reputation for discipline and precision, was a marvel of organization. But a commander trying to coordinate a troop movement across a vast territory would face a nightmare of conflicting local times. A unit might arrive an hour late for a rendezvous because its clock was set to the local village time, not the army's time. This was a logistical flaw that could cost a battle. The solution was simple, but its implementation was a monumental bureaucratic task. All military units were to operate on Berlin time. Messengers and officers were given precise instructions to synchronize their watches at every major city. Our protagonist is a meticulous bureaucrat named Friedrich von Luttwitz. He was not a general, but a low-ranking official in the Ministry of Public Works. His job was to oversee the construction of new roads and canals. In his time, this was a project fraught with delays and inefficiencies. A construction crew might be late to a work site because they were operating on the local town's clock, not the ministry's. Materials would arrive late, and laborers would be paid for time they didn't work. Von Luttwitz, a man obsessed with order, saw this as a problem of misaligned clocks. He believed that the lack of synchronized time was a form of administrative chaos. He began a quiet, personal crusade to standardize time beyond the military. He convinced his superiors to issue a new regulation. All government offices and public works projects were to operate on Prussian Standard Time, a concept that was entirely new. This meant that every government clerk, every tax collector, and every construction worker had to synchronize their daily schedules with a single central clock in Berlin. The idea was met with initial resistance. People were used to their local time, a system that had been in place for centuries. They argued that it was a pointless, overly bureaucratic rule. But von Luttwitz was relentless. He developed a simple, elegant system to enforce the new rule. He had small, portable clocks, calibrated to the master clock in Berlin, distributed to every government office and public works site. He also mandated that daily reports had to be time-stamped, making it easy to see if a department was operating on the wrong time. This seemingly boring change had a profound effect. It eliminated confusion, increased efficiency, and, most importantly, instilled a new kind of discipline in the Prussian bureaucracy, the idea of synchronized time, a concept we take for granted today, was a radical one. It was a step towards a unified, centralized state where every part of the system operated on the same rhythm. This discipline, born of the military and nurtured by bureaucrats, would soon extend to the entire nation. What would happen when this rigid system of synchronized time faced its biggest challenge? The unpredictable chaos of a rapidly expanding railway network. The railway was a revolutionary force, but in a world of conflicting local times, it was also a logistical nightmare. A train traveling from one city to another would arrive at a station on one time zone and depart on another, creating mass confusion for passengers and a high risk of accidents. The problem was not just one of convenience, it was a matter of safety. A misaligned clock could mean two trains on the same track, a disastrous consequence that the rigid Prussian state could not tolerate. Friedrich von Luttwitz, our meticulous bureaucrat, saw the railway as the ultimate test of his system. He argued that the only way to make the trains run on time and to ensure their safety was to enforce Prussian Standard Time across the entire railway network. This was a far greater challenge than standardizing time in government offices. The railways were a sprawling, decentralized system, and the powerful railway companies were resistant to any government interference. They saw it as a pointless bureaucracy that would slow down their business. Von Luttwitz, however, had an ally in the military. The army, which had long benefited from synchronized time, understood the strategic importance of a reliable railway network. They argued that a railway system that was not on a single standardized time was a military liability. The military's support gave von Luttwitz the leverage he needed. He was given a new, powerful role, inspector of railway time. He and his team, armed with a new set of regulations, began a methodical, unglamorous campaign to synchronize every railway station clock in Prussia. The process was a marvel of boring but effective bureaucracy. Von Luttwitz's team would arrive at a station with a chronometer calibrated to Berlin time. They would check the station clock, and if it was off by even a few seconds, they would correct it and issue a formal report. This was not a one-time event. It was a continuous, relentless process. They also established a system of time signals sent via the telegraph, allowing stations to constantly check their clocks against the master clock in Berlin. The telegraph, a new technology, was used not for grand messages, but for the most mundane of purposes, sending a daily, automated signal to keep the clocks in sync. The resistance to this new system was fierce. Station masters complained that it was an impossible task. Passengers complained that they had to constantly adjust their watches. But von Luttwitz and his team were unyielding. They issued fines for non-compliance and publicly shamed stations that failed to meet their standards. The system, like a finely tuned machine, began to work. The trains, for the first time, were running with a new level of predictability and safety. This was not the result of a single brilliant invention, but of 1,000 small, boring, and meticulous acts of bureaucratic enforcement. The clockwork empire was taking shape. The synchronization of the railways was a watershed moment. It was a clear demonstration that a centralized, disciplined approach to something as simple as time could have a profound effect on the efficiency and safety of a nation's infrastructure. It also created a new kind of social contract. For the first time, the people of Prussia were all operating on the same clock. This was a subtle but profound change. It was a step towards a unified national identity, a world where the most important thing was not the local time in your village, but the official time in Berlin. But what would happen when this rigid top-down system of centralized time was met with the very human impulse to resist control? And how would a single minor rebellion against the Prussian clock lead to an unexpected change in how the entire nation approached its daily life? The forced adoption of Prussian Standard Time was not without its discontents. While the railways and bureaucracy were now running on a single clock, the average person's life was still governed by the rhythm of the sun and the tradition of local time. For a farmer, the idea of living by a clock that was set hundreds of miles away was both ridiculous and irrelevant. This quiet, persistent resistance was a challenge to the very idea of a centralized state. The Prussian government, however, had a brilliant solution, one that would cement its control in a far more subtle and powerful way. The solution was not to force people to change their ways, but to make it so inconvenient for them not to. The government began to publish all official documents, from military conscription orders to tax collection dates, with Prussian Standard Time as the only reference. This meant that if a young man was ordered to report for military service at 10 a.m. on Monday, He had to know what time that was in Berlin, not in his local village. The government also began to use the railway stations, the hubs of this new standardized time, as official collection points for all government business. To get a passport, to pay a fine, or to pick up a message, a person had to go to the station and, by extension, had to adopt the station's clock. The most ingenious and subtle form of control came from the postal system. The mail, which was now transported by train, was organized and delivered according to the new standardized time. This meant that if you wanted to receive your mail on time, you had to be on the railway's schedule, not your own. The Prussian state, a master of boring and effective bureaucracy, had turned its most vital services into a powerful tool of cultural assimilation. The people, over time, began to adopt the new time, not out of fear of punishment, but out of simple, practical necessity. The legacy of the Clockwork Empire is a profound one. It is a story of how a seemingly insignificant administrative detail standardized time was used to unify a chaotic, fragmented nation. The Prussian government understood that to build a powerful state, you had to first create a common rhythm, a shared understanding of time that transcended local tradition. This discipline, born of military necessity and refined by bureaucrats, would go on to influence not just the rest of Germany, but the entire world. The idea of a single, standardized time zone, a concept we take for granted today, has its roots in the meticulous, boring work of a Prussian bureaucrat named Friedrich von Luttwitz. It is a testament to the fact that the most significant transformations in history are often brought about not by grand philosophical ideas or revolutionary violence, but by the quiet, methodical application of boring, everyday logistics. The punctual, well-oiled machine of the Prussian state was built not on a grand battlefield, but in a dusty government office, where a man with a clock decided to change the world. Settle in and let us travel back to ancient Rome, an empire whose power and longevity were built not just on its legions, but on its astonishing network of roads. The famous phrase, "All roads lead to Rome," was a literal truth, a testament to a vast and complex infrastructure that connected the farthest corners of the empire. While we marvel at the engineering of the Via Appia or the Via Latina, the true story of these roads lies not in their initial construction, but in the unglamorous, constant, and utterly essential work of their maintenance. This is the story of the unsung heroes who kept the empire moving, the Roman road maintenance crews. The Roman roads, or viae, were a marvel of civil engineering. They were built to last, with multiple layers of stone, gravel, and sand, often elevated for drainage. But even the best-built road is subject to the relentless forces of nature and heavy traffic. The Roman state understood that the roads were not a one-time investment, but a continuous responsibility. This responsibility fell to a dedicated, statist group of officials and laborers, known as the curators virum, the road commissioners, and their maintenance crews. The job of a road maintenance crew was the epitome of physical drudgery. They were not glorious legionaries marching to conquest. They were slaves, laborers, and military veterans, tasked with the mundane but critical work of filling potholes, clearing drainage ditches, and resurfacing worn-out sections of road. Their world was one of back-breaking labor, simple tools, and the constant smell of dust and sweat. Their lives were a testament to the fact that the most impressive achievements of an empire are often built on the backs of its most humble citizens. The Roman state had a complex system for funding and organizing road maintenance. Major roads were funded by the imperial treasury, while local roads were the responsibility of the provincial governments and local landowners. This created a complicated, often confusing, bureaucratic landscape. The curators virum were responsible for overseeing this entire system, ensuring that the work was done to a high standard and that the funds were not being embezzled. It was a job that required a keen eye for detail and a strong will to fight corruption. Our protagonist is a grizzled veteran named Lucius. After a long career in the legions, he was given a new, less glamorous, but equally important post, a curator of a small section of a major road in Britannia. His section was a crucial link between two major military forts, and its condition was of paramount importance. He had a small crew of laborers and a limited budget. His job was a constant, low-grade battle against entropy. Every day he would walk his section of the road, looking for cracks, uneven stones, and blocked drainage channels. He was a master of his craft, and he knew that a small problem, if left unattended, could become a major issue. He believed that the integrity of a road was a reflection of the integrity of the empire. A well-maintained road meant that commerce could flow, armies could march, and news could travel. A poorly maintained road meant delays, accidents, and a creeping sense of decay. Lucius, with his limited resources, was a physical embodiment of this idea, but his quiet, methodical work was about to be put to the test. A new, more ambitious curator was appointed to a neighboring section of the road, a man who saw his job not as a duty, but as a path to personal wealth. What would happen when a conflict between two men, one dedicated to public service and the other two, personal gain, threatened the very integrity of a vital artery of the Roman Empire?